Hi, welcome back to our Digging Deeper companion series. This is a video series that's meant to go in conjunction with our Daniel series that are going out to the whole church on Sunday mornings. This will be about Daniel chapter 3, and like other videos, we're going to try to give you some tips and some tools for how you can be studying God's Word more in-depthly yourself. Joining with us as a church together, we're going through each chapter of this book. So let's dive in. Now, the first 2 weeks, we talked about kind of this big pillar of Bible study methods, one of the big concepts for us to practice, which is observation, or the ability to read the text well, to try to track and key in on what is being said. A lot of times, we tend to read pretty quickly or at a pretty surface level. And so we're giving you some different tools, some things to think about, and we're breaking it up as we go through the chapters of Daniel. So in week 1 with Daniel 1, we talked about observation, and particularly with the structure or the setting or the form of the text itself. And to keep an eye out on that, Daniel chapter 2, we chose to focus on the list of just some really good questions to ask. Now, as we come to Daniel chapter 3, we're still going to be discussing kind of the principles of observation. Next week, actually, we're going to move on to interpretation. But to round out our thing on observation, I want to talk about the skill or keeping in mind the broader contextualization of the chapter. What came before it, what came after it, how does this fit in with the larger narrative structure of the book, kind of that golden thread that goes through, to try to keep both, here's the individual story in front of me, but how is this connecting to the whole, to keep that in mind and that question on the top of our minds as we come to study God's Word. And actually we're going to see that really helps give us some context to understand what's happening in this chapter. So, Daniel chapter 3, a lot of people know it as, the fiery furnace, or this is maybe one of the stories that you heard when you were growing up in Sunday school, the flannel graph people, if you grew up in the church. This is a story that we tell a lot of kids. Always a bit weird because it's a bit, scary of a story, I guess. But I mean, hey, Disney movies are scary these days anyway. So there is this story that a lot of us are familiar with, at least in broad context. But we got to be careful because sometimes that can actually work against us. Stories that we kind of had well, here's the meaning, or here's the very simplistic kind of takeaway that's appropriate for kids in a certain time and place. Sometimes that can mask a much more in-depth story. And so we have to be careful if we feel like, oh, we know this, to still try to come with fresh eyes. And observation is going to help us do that. Now, you do want to practice, what we've learned in previous weeks. So go ahead and try to chart out what's the structure or maybe the outline of the story. What's the big story arc in this chapter? Try to think through that. I'd encourage you to go through paragraph by paragraph and ask some of those just basic investigative questions that we talked about last week. And one other thing I want to put as kind of a tool in your toolbox here is this idea of keeping the big picture or the context of the book itself in mind. So, for example, this becomes significant in this chapter. So in Daniel chapter 3, it doesn't start with the furnace, right? That's later in the story. What it starts with is the statue, and the statue is a completely gold statue. Now, again, whether that was hammered gold upon an exterior of some sort of brick or other metal, we don't really know. The text really isn't concerned with that, but it is to say that there's Nebuchadnezzar's all of a sudden shifting to create this giant statue purely of gold, and he wants it to be a big deal. How do we know that? Because of the people who are mentioned that are bowing down, we presume that it was, just everyday Babylonians as they're walking by. But actually the text calls out kind of government workers, right? It calls out satraps, it calls out advisors, basically people who are in the court life are supposed to make this show. So there is a bit of an emphasis in the text. It's not just generically everybody, although we presume that. The text wants to focus on, these are kind of the power brokers of the day. These are the people who are in positions of influence, and there's a bit of a consolidating effort that's going on here. Also, the emphasis that Nebuchadnezzar wants it all people, all languages, to do this exact same thing, all religious backgrounds. And that makes sense when we think of the fact that Nebuchadnezzar's policy of growing his empire was taking the thought leaders from one capital of another, conquered nation, as an example, and moving them to Babylon. Well, that's a hodgepodge of a lot of people that he wants to all have them consolidate around this sort of half government, half religious type of service. And that was pretty common then. They were very tied. Unlike maybe today, we tend to have more separation in that. But the question is, why the statue? Now, if you're just reading this section by yourself, you might be tempted to stop at the fact of going, oh, maybe it's just self-serving. It's a statue of him. We actually don't know what the statue was of. Or it was a statue of Bel or Marduk or one of the Babylonian kind of pantheon features. And that's just it. It's about apostasy. It's about serving other gods. But if we don't look at the context, if we don't try to put it in the broader picture of what's happening in the book of Daniel, then we can miss a really important connection, because what was the last chapter about? And this is a challenge for us, because we tend to just go, I want to read this paragraph. And oftentimes we don't read an entire book, or if we do it in such small chunks or over such a broad amount of time that we don't actually remember all the things that happened 3 chapters ago. And we don't read books like that today. If you have a novel or something that's a real page turner, you're just kind of consuming that pretty quickly. So I'd encourage you to actually try to just start with a broad reading of the text. When you come to the book of Daniel to do some really detailed study, whether it's been a long time since you've read it, maybe you've never read it, it's really good just to sit down, mark out some time, grab a cup of coffee, and actually just try to do a full reading of the text, and then come back into and try to do a more in-depth study of the individual chapters. It's going to help you keep this broader context in mind. So an example why this is important, the statue. Chapter 2 was very much about a vision of a statue, and the head of it was gold. And then it kind of has permutations after that of different types of valuable metals till it gets to this mixed iron clay point, and that ultimately becomes the demise or the downfall. It should strike us as, wait, we've heard this before. When we start the very next section of text is about this same man who's later trying to create a giant statue for all to bow down to, but instead of just the top being gold, the whole thing is gold. And if we go back and we look at Daniel's interpretation, we see Daniel was saying, you were this gold kind of head of the statue, but it changes over time. You eventually lose your place, and God is the one who will rule. So really what we see is kind of a thematic rebellion against the prophecy of chapter 2. And that's going to tell us a lot about Nebuchadnezzar. He's very thankful and appreciative of Daniel for sharing this truth. He has a respect for it. But in the context, as we're watching his character develop chapter by chapter, we're actually seeing him react and try to oppose what God's effort is and what God's will is in this situation. So when we look at it in context, it's not just a person who had an idea one day about a statue because it's general apostasy. This is actually Nebuchadnezzar digging his heels in and trying to change the prophetic word that was given through Daniel, interpreted through Daniel, given through a dream. So that helps us put it in a framework. Let's talk about some of the other characters too. So when we talk about characters, it's always good, especially if you've heard as a children's story and you're used to them being flat flannel graph characters, pun intended in that. A flat character, right, is a character that's just very, they only have one thing, right? Either they're always all angry or they're simpering, or it's not a rounded individual with complex inner workings. We tend to want to reduce characters to these sort of flat situations. Try as you're reading the text to actually try to get into what their motivation might be. And then how do you see that progress over time? So Nebuchadnezzar is a good example of this. He has an appreciation for some of the results that he sees happening in Daniel and his three friends, and some of the ways that they're excelling in wisdom, but it's not tied directly to God. So he appreciates the results, things are going well, that's fine. You get to the second chapter, and he's impressed with the display of power, and he has a respect for the fact that Daniel can divinely interpret dreams. But keep in mind, this person, believes in lots of gods, all that kind of have different realms and powers and, specialties, if you will, that you may want to beseech if there's something you're trying to do in particular. So he has a respect for God. And in this chapter, we see it go a bit further. He has a proclamation that says you can't say anything bad about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God. Why? Because he saw just this incredible display of power. But notice he's still saying your God. Okay, it's not his God. So in the beginning, there was just some positive, affirmations of, hey, you guys are doing a pretty good job. Chapter 2, I have respect for you and the God that you serve. And then chapter 3, he's progressing even further and going, wow, this is amazing. In fact, I now make a decree, nobody is allowed to say anything negative about their God, but remember, it's still external. Now, keep an eye on what happens to Nebuchadnezzar and his motivation, his thinking, what's going on under the hood in chapter 4. And you're going to watch the progression of this world ruler and how he operates. Again, try to observe the big flow of what's happening. The court magicians are another good example of this, right? They start as kind of peers, and they lose out on some of the test scores. They don't do as good as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Chapter 2, it gets a little bit more tense. Their failure is highlighted. Daniel's success is highlighted, and he's put in a position of power. Now in chapter 3, we get to a point where they're, tattletale's a bit of a, I don't know, maybe not the most appropriate term, but where they're definitely going, it seems like they're trying to sandbag these guys. And so try to understand what is happening in them, what's happening in their motivations, how are they changing as characters in this unfolding narrative as we go forward, because it's going to continue to mount. What is kind of a passive resentment will become a very hostile active threat as the story continues on. So just as examples, keep the big context for any imagery, plot lines from previous chapters like the statue, characters, how they develop, try to observe how it flows and in the whole context of the narrative of the story, how's it being developed, not just this chapter. You see that in Nebuchadnezzar, you see that in kind of the magicians. Lastly, I would say is track themes, okay? So when we talk about understanding, we mentioned this last week, try to keep an eye on when there's kind of these breakout moments where there's almost as if the text and the storytelling is trying to get you to really sit on this one phrase. It's kind of flashing at you. Key points of emphasis. In this one, you get the question that Nebuchadnezzar poses when he says, where is it here? Verse 15, and who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands? That's a very climactic moment within the storytelling itself, because it leaves it at the consequence, as already been said, and it sets it up for how will you respond. Here's the threat. Here's the reality of the world as I see it. Now make your choice. And that moment where it just kind of hangs in the air. Again, try to put yourself in their position. What would they be feeling? What would they be thinking? That's kind of a very dramatic point of the story. If it were a movie, that'd be where, everything goes quiet and everybody pauses for this intense moment. Okay, now this question, remember, we're trying to keep the big picture of the book in mind and observe things in light of its whole contextual development, its narrative development. So when he asks this question, who is able to save you from my hands? This should trigger in us, this is a bigger question in the book. This isn't intended to just be a question for these three people in this moment. In fact, it's meant to be kind of a key tension point in the entire book of Daniel. because Daniel's about the rise and fall of nations, and in the midst of this, God's people are being ground down. Okay, the nation has been plundered, it's been sacked, razed to the ground. People have been taken. It seems like all is lost. There's not a secret army somewhere being raised up to rebel. I mean, it really, the picture's pretty bleak, particularly for those reading in Daniel's day or soon after. But this is the question of the book. Who is able to save you? Who could possibly save you from this great grand world power who's on a zenith high at this point, when you're on probably the lowest of lows that you're going to see? And that's the question that becomes a driving concern throughout the book. And the mini answer that we get here is intended to be extrapolated to the bigger question of the book. And namely, in the very first chapter, when we read this, again, trying to keep the whole, observing the narrative arc, the threads that are moving through each of these chapters, right? It was the question of where was God when Nebuchadnezzar came, and God gave it to Nebuchadnezzar. He gave over the victory to this pagan nation. Why? And can God somehow preserve his people even in the midst of this? That's going to be a question that is continually brought up throughout this book in different ways and different stories, but that's something that we really need to track with and go, oh, wait a minute, this is kind of a big question for us, because it's not just for these guys, it's for the book. And then even at a much higher level for us, it's not just about them, it's not just about the story of the book, it's actually a story about us and how we deal with confrontation, and when it seems like God maybe isn't able to save us, or we're just incredulous that he could possibly show up when the deck is so stacked. So observation. Check out the setting, structure, form. How's the text kind of being arranged? What can you learn from that? Ask some really good investigative questions. We talked about that last week. And try to observe what's happening through both characters, themes, and imagery or plot points over the various chapters. And we'll kind of see how these develop throughout the book of Daniel. These are just some great tools for you as you dig in. Let me close with just a couple of things that might prime you for some ways to study. We talked about this in the message. One of the really fascinating points of this chapter is the fact that God did not save them before they went into the fire. What does that say about God? Secondly, I would encourage you to look at this tying of religion and government and some of the challenges that creates. That's a good thing for us to meditate on and even think on today. How do we balance those two things out, where to be a good Babylonian means to bow down to this statue, and to bow down to this statue means to be a good Babylonian? There's some inherent difficulties within that. And what does that even say about how we're supposed to think and interact with some of these broader social structures, even as we engage with our faith? Third thing to look at, and there's way more, I'm just giving you some off the top of my head here, is to really consider Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's response to the king. That holds this balance of, I do believe that God can and will do this, but if God doesn't, there's a lot of, maybe some people who go, hey, if you just kind of name it and claim it sort of stuff, if you say it, God is kind of somehow duty bound to do this for you. What does it look like to hold a robust faith of what God can and what you believe God would do, but still hold God has a sovereign will, and we may not always be the ones to best understand that? How does that tension, and it is a tension, play out in our lives, and what does this story teach us about that? So there's just a couple things to think about. There's plenty more in this text. I encourage you, dig in, observe well, try to understand the structure as it flows, and really engage this text and let it shape your life for the good. Thanks so much for checking us out. Come on back next week for Daniel chapter 4 as we start with some basic rules of biblical interpretation. We'll see you then.